This episode of the podcast is brought to you by LeafWell. Hello, listeners of Cannabinoid Connect. Have you ever thought about getting a medical cannabis card? The process can be intimidating and difficult to navigate, to say the least. That's why I've partnered with LeafWell, the easiest and most affordable way to get a medical card in Texas and in 32 other states in the US. LeafWell seamlessly connects you to a network of doctors that will help you get certified online in minutes. LeafWell is run by data scientists, cannabis specialists, and patient advocates that are passionate about increasing access and education around medical cannabis use. LeafWell's patient support team is also there to support you throughout your entire journey using medical cannabis. As I mentioned, I've partnered with LeafWell to provide all my listeners with a discount to become certified for medical cannabis. Simply go to their website at leafwell.com and use the promo code CCTX to receive $15 off the price of getting a medical card. Again, that's leafwell.com. Use the promo code CCTX to receive $15 off the price of getting a medical cannabis card. LeafWell only charges if you get approved. So what do you have to lose? Visit leafwell.com today. Use the promo code CCTX to get certified for medical cannabis, risk-free. Hey, Milan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back, Kevin.
Of course, man. Can you believe it's been a year?
I know it's passed too quickly, super fast, but at least we survived the onslaught of inflation and multiple interest rate raises by the Fed.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like after the pandemic, there's just been a slew of other kind of things that have been happening, especially within the economy. And yeah, I think even today, today's December 14th, that the Fed had a new announcement. So yeah, it just continues to the interest rates continue to hike, and it's really hurting certain industries. In fact, all industries, and cannabis is not excluded from that. But outside of the financial side, Milan, I want to talk to you about the regulatory landscape as it relates to cannabis and hemp and the testing that goes along with it. I mean, obviously, you being the CEO and co-founder of PathogenDx, which we've talked about, like I said, a year ago, how the regulatory landscape is falling short in terms of protecting consumer health, among other things. I think that you were quoted or you byline an article talking about this. But before we dive into that, let's refresh the audience in terms of your background. Give us a sense of kind of, where you started and what led you to where you're at today in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on the show again. My history is, basically, I had invested in a parent company to PathogenDx that had developed a very different type of technology to test for many things in a single test, in a single sample. And the company was really focused on sort of human clinical diagnostics, right? Like if you've got, infectious disease or some kind of disease, and the disease is caused by many different, targets, for example, whether it's a gene mutation or it's a DNA or RNA sample that's bacterial, for example. What's going on in the world right now is you're getting these co-infections between influenza and COVID and RSV, and there's more than one virus that's causing, kids or adults to be sick. And so, the nutshell is that was the real, value of this technology. And so it was, I'd invested in the parent company back about, a decade ago. And, really, it didn't really go anywhere because we had to go scale the FDA wall. And that was a different, story all in its own. But the nutshell was we didn't do it. We didn't commercialize. We had to repivot. We repivoted into cannabis primarily with the assumption that we could apply the technology in cannabis with the state level regulatory hurdle being a little bit lower, which it was. And the good news is in the cannabis sector, you've got, in like the food sector where chicken, you can get sickness on uncooked chicken or from salmonella. There's one bug that you can get sick from in the food industry or with beef. E. coli or lettuce, E. coli. In the world of cannabis, you got half a dozen or more, and this was the perfect match made in heaven. The industry had a lot more bugs to worry about in terms of safety than the food industry, and that's sort of how we got started. And so we rolled back the truck, and the quick story is we identified labs in the space back in 2014, 2015 that would look at our technology, and lo and behold, it was something that worked really well for labs, primarily because I just didn't want the cannabis sector to repeat history like these other verticals like food and agriculture, environmental, where they would start off with the petri dish, and then the world of cannabis, with the crop being $360 per ounce, and each ounce is from one plant per 1 square foot in a grow. You're talking about millions of dollars. So with a whole high value crop, you couldn't wait 3, 5, 6, 7 days for your petri dish to come out of the oven, and somebody looks underneath the microscope and says, guess what, you've got aspergillus or E. coli or salmonella. And by then you've got a massive outbreak in your cultivation facility that's cost you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And so now we are in about 120 cannabis testing labs across 36 states, using the PathogenDx system that can give you an answer to whether the flower that was brought in from, grower A or cultivation facility B, and within a day, they'll have the answer of knowing whether that flower or non-flower matrix is contaminated. And the good news is we're able to get the answer sooner for the cultivators to do something about it that can help them, make sure they can either ship safe, and healthy product to the dispensaries, or, make sure that they hold back that and identify where exactly it is unsafe and cordon that section of the cultivation off so that they can continue to grow, safe cannabis or hemp in the rest of the facility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it makes sense. I mean, what you were talking about in terms of the journey, that pivot, right? Because cannabis in itself, especially a grow, provides the perfect environmental elements that would proliferate, like, certain pathogens, right? So because of the heat, the light, the humidity, the soil, so that obviously is a clear, indication of this is the space that y'all need to be in, right? So you mentioned you're in 26 states out of 36 that are medical. What are you seeing in terms of the differences in testing standards among those states? Is there any specific examples that you can talk us through?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the West Coast states they've been more sort of harmonized in terms of looking at what we call the sort of the big six bugs, that's the E. coli 0157, which is a pathogenic one, Salmonella enterica, which is the bacterial one that even you find on chicken, and then 4 aspergillus species, Flavus, Fumigatus, Niger, and Terrius. And ironically, there's a good level of uniformity in the Western states, from California all the way towards Colorado. And then you start to see quite a difference in the Midwest and the Eastern, and there's a lot more focus on less so the pathogenic ones and more in what are called the class indicator organisms. And you'll start to see aerobic, total coliform, like Michigan cares about, or some of the Eastern states, or BTGN. And there seems to be uniformity over one bug, which is really the E. coli, Salmonella, and the total Eastern mold. And that seems to be pretty much consistent across a lot of the states. But that's not telling. If you're not testing for aspergillus, you're really missing a big part of the equation on safety, because there's been a lot of clinical cases historically on aspergillosis, where if you've got a immunocompromised consumer or patient, that can be somewhat deadly. So we haven't really reached harmonization across all the states, the 39 states, in terms of regulations, and they wreak havoc to companies like mine, because you're trying to, develop tests that can fit, all these states. But the problem is it's creating different different flavors of it, which drives different validations, drives different level of proficiency. And that's the complexity that we're dealing with in today's environment.
Why has there not, like, has there not been that consensus? Like, here's the standard in terms of, among the states. Obviously, the lack of federal reform is not helping, right? But I have had guests on where they're literally directly involved with, like, working with other states who have gone adult use to implement some of the best practices that they've seen in terms of legislation or regulation. So in this aspect, I mean, are the states talking to each other? Like, why is there such a difference between the West and the Midwest, and then even the East Coast, like you said? Like,
I think that it's getting better, to be not to be overly negative about it or pessimistic about it, but I think it's going too slowly. I think the second pressure point is, when you look at if you looked at a dollar bill for representing the entire cannabis sector, you can legitimately say 80 or 90% is influenced by the growers, right? And good, bad, or ugly, the fact of the matter is, their agendas are different relative to regulators and relative to, testing labs. So initial influence has been, different relative to safety, efficacy, and health related to cannabis. And if you can, like, Colorado didn't really have aspergillus until, guess what, 2022, but they've been legalized since 2018. Why didn't they have aspergillus? Because there's been enough cases historically to say if one case is enough. If it was your loved one that suddenly smoked or consumed cannabis with aspergillus and, God forbid, died, then that's enough. But the thing is, though, those states were slow to come to realization, and they have. I mean, it takes a while to build momentum, but it's hard to really pinpoint and put your thumb on one real driver. And I think there's a lot of money and influence in not necessarily doing the right thing. Now, tomorrow, let's just say you and I are God for the day, and we say, click our fingers, and it becomes federalized tomorrow. I can certainly say that the very next day, the kind of, stringent testing regulations that, for example, the FDA as a regulatory, enforcement body, right, would be much more stringent, and everything would be more uniform, because there's no room for, how do I say it? There's no room for risk. And certain states have allowed that level of risk, and maybe you can't sort of embrace it and say, well, the risk is high or low or medium, but risk is risk. And once one person gets sick, that's enough. And the industry isn't used to zero tolerance, but in the world of the food world, of the pharmaceutical world, or the medical device world, that's basically enforced under FDA. There's no room for risk.
Right. What's fascinating about that point is that the states allowing for risk, like you said, when it comes to consumer safety, and of course that's happening within cannabis and hemp, but it's happening on two fronts. It's happening both in states where it's legal, right? To your point, you're talking about how that's happening, but it's also happening in states where it's super illegal, right? Like take Texas, for example. Of course, hemp is legal, but even with hemp being legal in Texas, the lack of enforcement by the state, of course, not lack of federally, but it's kind of like the Wild West. I mean, I have a good friend who owns a testing lab, and just, the amount of lab shopping and just different things that go on, not to say it's all like that in Texas, but I'm saying it happens, right? So it's just interesting how on both sides, even when it's legal and it's not, and it's all due to the fact that there is not federal reform where, like you said, the FDA stepping in and really standardizing some of this stuff.
Yeah, it is a great point you're making, Kevin. And I think it's if the states they've legalized the industry, and the unfortunate piece of all of this is that if we were running Colorado or Arizona, the proper thing to do, all of these regulatory bodies generally, most of them are under the Department of Health. And the Department of Health's, mission in life is public health. So you're supposed to really uphold that. And there's been either a lack of funding, for whatever reason, there's less of an enforcement. And most of the enforcement is what is the labs doing wrong, right? As opposed to what's going on in the grows. And so, you're going to chase this problem a little bit more. It's like this lab shopping thing is literally, they don't like the result. They didn't like the result because you didn't pass a bad product.
Right.
And then, so the real reason is that why is there failures on the sample? DNA doesn't lie. And, you in your own body are made of DNA. So if you're not the real, Kevin, who is the fake Kevin at the end of the day, right? So in the same case, when a testing lab is testing, so long as they've got good methodologies and certified methods, which most of the industries come a long way, the result is sort of the result. And so, the other side of the coin is that the growers don't like that, and then they go lab shopping because, potency wins the day. Number
That's
one.
what I was gonna say. Like in this hyper-focused potency world that we kind of currently live in some states, that's really it. They're chasing after that highest percentage of THC, right? I mean,
they are, and so, the agenda for today is just that, and I don't know if we'll ever shed that, but if we need to, we have to de-emphasize it, because the reality on the ground for this industry is that tomorrow, when we finally have to look at a FBI agent in the face, and our compatriots and us, our partners, which we all support, don't get me wrong, in this wonderful podcast, this is a discussion we have, and we may disagree with what we're saying here, but the fact of the matter is, the reality is, tomorrow we will be put under this pharma model in terms of having sterility testing, which means that if you and I are taking a pharmaceutical drug, they have to do full sterility testing on that drug. And they have to make sure there's not only is it the bugs that are harmful to humans, but any other bugs. So let's just talk about in growers, they got powdery mildew, they got mucor, they got botrytis, they got fusarium, they've got alternaria, they got candida. So there's a host of 20 other bacterial and fungal organisms flying around in a medical grade cannabis cultivation facility. And so the reality for tomorrow's cultivation grower is that if the FBI was overseeing them under a pharma sterility model, they'd say, look, Mr. Grower, we're happy that none of your weed has E. coli, salmonella, and the force aspergillus for that will hurt the human, but there are the other 12 that are just sitting on that weed that we do not want. We want an absolutely pure product, because we have no idea tomorrow, a month, a year, 5 years, or 10 or 20 years down the road, that these other bugs may cause basically a public health crisis. And that's the risk that the FDA will not take, and they've chosen that's the highest standard of clean, of CGMP. It's called continuous good manufacturing, to make sure that the weed that you're growing in, that you're identifying any risk areas and eliminating those risk areas. The water that's being used, the soil that's being used, the fertilizer or any growth medium that's being used does not influence negatively on the purity of the product. And why this is an important one is that at the end of the day, this is sort of the real writing on the wall. When people have said, hey, Kevin, the writing's on the wall, that's the writing on the wall that the industry needs to read, why we're having this conversation, this incredible podcast.
Yeah, well, I mean, first off, there's tons, I feel like, writings on the wall. Not to downplay this important one, right? But I mean, now's the time to really do things right, as we've kind of echoed on this podcast, because eventual reform is going to happen at the federal level. And when that happens, like you said, the FDA and other departments within the federal government are going to step in to start overseeing what's happening, and they're going to implement standards. And so the standards that you just talked about, which are the highest level according to the FDA, that's I want to clarify. So that's for pharmaceutical drugs, like all pharmaceutical drugs. And so at that point, I mean, so I would imagine that psychedelics, for instance, like psilocybin, are already going through that process, right? Because they're kind of taking the fast track when it comes to the pharmaceutical route as opposed to cannabis.
Yeah, and so if we want to call it medical marijuana, once you use the word medical, then in the federal model, everything that's a medical is then overseen by the FDA.
Right.
And so they're not going to say, hey, guess what, bunch of guys, great industry, we're going to give you a different model to comply to in terms of standards. What do we think the chances of that are? We're not going to get more lenient regulations than what multi-billion-dollar pharma has put in. So the pharma lobby will come out and say, guess what? If we're being asked to make pills in the, at the purest levels, then, the cannabis industry is going to have to make medical grade, product at the cleanest levels. And so, it's stating the obvious, it's common sense, people sort of know it, but the question is, how do we do this in baby step fashion so we don't hit the brick wall when it finally is imminently facing us, in the very short term?
Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking long term here, right? What are some more short term, rigorous or comprehensive testing solutions that the federal government could do as of now? You think that could really propel us in the right direction? What are some small wins we can get?
Yeah, so this is some of the things. Let's talk about the testing side of it specifically. If you look at the USDA, they have implemented a thing called HACCP. It's hazard analysis critical control points. And what that means is effectively anything that's a food or product touching surface needs to be swabbed environmentally, meaning you swab that area where you're a trim table or trimming tools in a cultivation facility, right? The water source, right? The airflow. So anything that's food product touching, for example, essentially would need to be swabbed frequently to know that if there's a pathogen growing, that you're not transferring from one batch of weed to the next batch to the next batch. And what we've identified over the last, several, couple of years, even since the last podcast, is we've identified at least 12 to 24 areas in a cultivation facility where we continuously, repetitively, regularly see the same bugs reoccurring. And I think the industry, when I say the cultivators, it behooves them to have to do environmental monitoring, because that's the first baby step. Because the federal government tomorrow, it's not swinging the pendulum to the other side, but they'll ask them to do that. Now, if you do that, then the incidents the grower will be able to identify where the hot zones are, how regularly they're reoccurring, and then they will be able to remediate, meaning clean and disinfect and put a proper standard operating procedure. So instead of me saying, guess what, I'm going to clean this tool once every quarter, and they'll find that the trimming tool is getting reinfected every 2 weeks, suddenly you're going to put in every 2 weeks SOP for cleaning the trimming tools.
Right.
And that helps in reducing the incidence of these bugs on the final plant, right? On the flower that goes to a cannabis testing lab. That means the incidence of failures will drop. That means the entire ecosystem, from the growers to the testing labs to ultimately the consumer wins, will be happy, because you're not gonna get the lab shopping going on at that point. So if we control our environments in what we're growing, and we do our best to control it, that will be sort of the biggest lever we have on addressing some of the challenges that you brought up regarding, testing results, and lab shopping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, those are just, I mean, when you explain that, when you give that example, it seems obvious when you hear it, right? Like, but you don't think about it, right? Because it's not included in your SOPs, or, you're just used to kind of operating in one certain fashion. And so just the table itself, like you said, cleaning that table because you're putting more product on that could be transferring certain pathogens or bacteria that could ultimately be harmful. Talk to me about PathogenDx's technologies and how they're, a differentiator among other popular testing technologies in the space.
Yeah, great question. I think the thing that also goes back to my history of why I like the technology that our company has, and is that we talked about having technological innovation to drive productivity, and that's happened everywhere, not just this industry and every other industry. And so the beauty of the PathogenDx technologies, it's basically able to test for many bacterial and fungal pathogens in a single test within 6 hours without the need for enriching the sample. Now, what does that mean? That means if you get a flower that comes from a cultivator, what happens is other technologies need to put that in a little broth, and they have to cook it overnight for bacterial. So the bugs, if there are bacterial pathogens on that flower, it promotes the growth of anything like E. coli, salmonella, and then after 24 or 30 hours, they're able to take that and they streak it on a petri dish, and they're able to identify what type of bug it is, whether it's E. coli, salmonella, or they'll take that and they'll run it through a PCR test, just like we've learned in COVID, and they'll identify that the DNA that they identified on that enriched sample is E. coli. Now, the beauty of our test is we avoid all that enrichment. So you go from anyway from 2 to 3 days from sample coming into a cannabis testing lab, and then the result happening 2 to 3 days later. For us, it's literally in the same day. And the reason why is we have a very, very, very sensitive technology that uses what is called endpoint PCR. It's where you're in that sample, you're able to identify the bugs. We're using what's called endpoint amplification. So there's chemistry that's called a primer that starts to search for those bugs that are E. coli, and they amplify to its endpoint after they fully consume the chemistry. So as opposed to qPCR, which stops the reaction and says, hey, I found something, but, and then the chemistry stops working. We can fully amplifies everything in that sample, and then we're able to drop it into a well. It sort of binds like a hybridization, it's called, and then you wash it and then you put it in an imager. So in 6 hours, you can literally run a sample and get the result. And with such a high value crop, you not only can be able to get one bug answers, if there's 12 different pathogens on that contaminated flower, you'll identify 12 of them uniquely, differently, and independently, but without running 12 separate tests. So the beauty is time is everything, right? Time is everything for this industry, for the food industry, for even if it was a clinical test. If you and I were in an ER department and we have a blood infection, time is everything before it turns into sepsis. So this is the precipice of our technology. The driving force is to reduce the time without losing the sensitivity or the performance and escalating the cost. We manage the cost to the same price or lower than at the same point as Petri dish testing. And this is called basically, microarray technology, which is a new invention. It's different than any other microarray technology because we've got like 8 patents that are different that, nobody else has been able to figure out. Mm-hmm. And it's taken 20 years of this type of technology for us to develop and apply to this industry, the food industry. We even applied it to COVID and the variants on COVID. And, it's faster, it's better, it's cheaper. And that doesn't necessarily mean when somebody says there's a new technology, the first thing that comes up in their mind is, oh, expensive. No, not for us. And that's why we're in about 120 labs nationally, because it's very, very competitive. You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm from what I understand, there's been some updates within your company. I mean, new products that you've recently released, and then I think there's been also some new leadership appointments. Is that right?
Yeah, great question. So, we launched most recently two things. We launched the PhytoX test, and the PhytoX test, Phyto is really plant pathogen. So basically, most recently, a lot of the West Coast growers, this is about a $3 to $4 billion problem. They're getting the cultivation facilities have huge viral infections, and there's this particular bug called latent hop varioid, as well as they've got alfalfa mosaic virus, Arabis mosaic virus. They've got a series of viral infections, contaminations, just like COVID for humans, but this is plants. And when they're touching each other, you can't necessarily see the virus infection. So it's like an asymptomatic. The plant looks healthy by itself, but doesn't mean a healthy looking plant is healthy because it's not visible to the eye. But that particular test we rolled out was 9 different viruses in a single test. Within 3 hours, a grower will be able to identify, we'll be able to help the grower identify, what the virus is. And so Pathogen intentionally delivered this test primarily because at the end of the day, there are other tests like it, but they're cheap and dirty tests like isothermal, tests, and they don't. When the viral load is not visible, that means that basically an isothermal test won't be able to detect it, and it'll give you a false negative. And so we've been able to master a very highly sensitive test for the PhytoX, so that growers can say, hey, even though this leaf clipping looks like it's healthy, guess what? We still detected it, even though it's not visible to the naked eye, that it has latent viroid. So that because otherwise it'll be too late, and it just spreads like wildfire at the end of the day. The second thing that we most recently launched was a automation platform. And we fundamentally believe that given COVID, and everybody talks about at the end of the day, they can't find employees, nobody wants to work, all of this, everybody's at that conversation. So the challenge is that we've created a very, the size of basically a little, toaster oven, basically a fully automated sample prep solution. So you can put 8 samples, and you can do roughly 48 samples for a lab, where you just press the button, you walk away, you come back after 30 minutes, you just change over the next 8 samples. And what it does is it saves significant time, cost, and labor, manual labor, to run the process. The more important thing is there's an entire generation focused on environmental sustainability. So in the lab testing world, everybody uses these little tips, and there's all different size tips when they're running these pathogen tests, whether it's, for competitive. What we've done with this particular technology is we use a single tip to do the entire sample process per sample, as opposed to 4 or 5 different tips, 6 tips. So what we've done is we've reduced the environmental plastic waste by about 90%, for a lab that's running 48 samples. So think about the amount of plastic that's going into landfills, and that takes years, tens of, hundreds, thousands of years to basically, biodegrade at the end of the day. Now we've focused on that in terms of sustainability, and that particular device is called Octa, and Octa means 8, and at the end of the day, it's not that costly. It fits the tight lab bench space, because you don't know, these labs have chock-a-block full of equipment, and they don't have much space. So what we've done is we've designed the instrument to these labs, basically, so it doesn't take a lot of footprint on the lab bench space. And that's coming out, we've got a huge backlog of orders. A lot of labs are interested at the end of the day. And, it's something that helps their issues of, you don't need super training for this thing. You just press the button, walk away, come back, and then you move on to the next step of the process.
Yeah, that seems pretty efficient. Yeah. And so what is Pathogen focused on for the remainder? I mean, what we got 2 weeks left in December, but I mean more specifically 2023 and beyond.
So, we're finalizing what we call is the final touches of the platform. We on everything that's on Okta, we will have all the regulated and unregulated tests. So there'll be just one instrument that can run one sample prep for all the regulated testing kits, which meets all the regulated testing markets, which we start off with the first question, the varying regulated. So we standardized it in a ubiquitous, uniform, universal platform. So if a lab network's got different regulations in Missouri versus New Jersey versus Maryland versus California, and they've got 4 labs, you can have that one standard that meets all those different regulations without having different kits, different instruments, different methods, different SOPs, and different bioinformatics. And so that's what we're planning to roll out in the first part of 2023. At that point, we fundamentally believe that our work is finished, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, and that we met the requirements of the most stringent requirements for this particular type of testing, so that it's not just able to meet state level testing today, but it's able to meet federal level testing tomorrow. And that's where we're sort of buttoning everything up.
I would imagine at that point, I mean, the work is somewhat not done because you're going to have to monitor like updates to the regulations or changes, right? To ensure that things are updated.
Yeah, we are. And so, the beauty of our thing is, remember that our test with the microarray, we can, if let's just say if a specific state or a federal body wants to add listeria, it's simple, because at the bottom of my microarray, we just add the probe for listeria or for Staph aureus or for Clostridium or whatever. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You just add that little piece of jigsaw puzzle, and it's pretty straightforward. We just add it in, we verify it, we validate it, we get it certified, and you go off and running. And it doesn't take years and years as opposed to other technologies. It just takes months. That's the difference.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's kind of like plug and play at that point. Well, Milan, I mean, this has been a really fascinating and interesting conversation. I mean, we've talked a lot. Again, the theme really was the regulatory landscape and how it's kind of falling short, particularly at the federal level at this point when it comes to protecting consumer health. We also touched on Pathogen and, the new products that you've rolled out and what you're focused on for 2023. So is there anything else that you want to touch on before we go here?
Well, I think, I like this narrative. I like the conversational piece. You're keeping it going, then the ball is rolling forward. So, the beauty is, we're doing the right thing, Kevin. We're doing the right thing at the end of the day. And when you're doing the right thing, we will ultimately prevail. And I'm not saying others are not doing the right thing, but we do need to educate better. We need to inform better. We need to communicate better. We need to discuss better. And I think, what you're doing is really helping that narrative. And, at the end of the day, I think that for me, I've been fortunate to be part of this mission, part of this journey to help the industry. And I want to help it because I just don't think that, I don't think that, we want to be, the pendulum needs to swing on the other side from a regulatory perspective. I believe in balanced regulation. I believe in, making sure that the product is affordable, both in terms of product testing, but the product itself. But the most important thing is that the product is safe for consumption. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to be in a situation where, we're in the same movie replaying out like is in the tobacco industry, right? Or, we saw the vape pen issue about 2 years ago. So we do have to do these things, because otherwise it's a grade report that we have to correct on going forward. And I think, there's enough people behind this that I think very, very confident. I've started to see good news out of California enforcing, lab shopping, all of this stuff and the bad actors. And I think it'll be a completely different industry in 2 years. And I think we'll be talking more of what can we do additional to that can really transform the industry, just like these kinds of podcasts have helped to the entire industry. So I want to thank you on that opportunity for me to be on this show.
Well, yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I couldn't do it without the guests who are on the front lines that actually are the experts in it. So appreciate your time and the work that you are doing at Pathogen and the team. So keep it up, and I look forward to following y'all's progress in the new year.
Thank you very much for having me. Hope you have a good New Year, and then I'll always look forward to talking to you more, because you make it very easy.
Awesome. Well, that's my only job, and I'm glad that it's working out. And of course, thanks for the audience. Thank you all for listening. Until next time. Bye, y'all.